I want to start by talking about the American Union. And I'll start by saying that the American Civil War, as you all know, lasted from 1861 to 1865, and it was undoubtedly a transformational moment in our nation's history, capturing the lives of 700,000 men at least, and freeing some 4 million men, women, and children who had been held as slaves. But it was also a critical moment in the history of the Constitution, and in fact, the Civil War was probably our greatest constitutional crisis. So today, I want to explore one of the key reasons why that was the case. And to do this, we need to think about the war in the way that many Americans did in 1861, which is as a crisis of the Union. Now, the word union is not one that we often use anymore, at least not in the way I'm going to talk about it here. But union was one of the most important words in American political and constitutional thinking during the first 100 years of our nation's history. In its most basic form, union was exactly what it sounded like, the joining of the states that made up the American nation. But for most Americans in the first half of the 19th century, the Union had a deeper meaning. It was a symbol of the democratic experiment in which government of and by the people was uniquely possible. And so the success of American democracy hinged on the continued maintenance of the American Union, the union of the states. And so in the early years of the Republic, you could find men from every party and every state promoting the importance of union, even people who shouldn't probably agree about anything. Reverence for the Union connected men like Thomas Jefferson to his chief rival, Alexander Hamilton. The Whig leader Henry Clay and his sworn enemy Andrew Jackson both repeatedly referenced their love of the Union. And even future Confederate President Jefferson Davis expressed a deep affection for the Union throughout the 1840s and 1850s. The problem was that in spite of this outpouring of love, not everyone agreed on the legal parameters of what this union was, and particularly when that union was formed. Still more confusing was its relationship to the Constitution. The Constitution itself is silent on when the Union was formed. It merely says in the preamble that we, the people, created the Constitution in order to form a more perfect union. What exactly a more perfect union looked like, or was, remained unclear in the text. And so as a result, several key questions about the Union remained in 1861. And perhaps the most important of these questions related to the question of perpetuity. Had the Constitution created a permanent union to which all joining states were forever bound? Or had the Constitution created a union of sovereign states, each of which retained the right to secede if it believed their interests had been violated? Did a state have the right to leave the Union? This was the primary constitutional question that framed the Civil War. By 1861, 11 of the 15 slaveholding states believed that their right to hold humans as property was in danger. These states argued that their liberty, the liberty to hold slaves, had been violated, and as a result, they were entitled to leave the Union and form their own confederacy. So in the months surrounding secession, men in both the remaining American states and in the new Confederacy developed sophisticated arguments about the legal status of the Union. And on both sides, these arguments were rooted in 3 types of evidence. First, they drew on interpretations of the history of the country prior to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Their second group of evidence came from inferences drawn from the Constitutional Convention and the language of the Constitution itself. And the third group of evidence came from selections from the speeches and writings of the Founding Fathers during the ratification debates and beyond. And so I just want to sketch here briefly the arguments on either side. And in each case, you'll notice that both groups really drew on the historical precedents in trying to establish whether the Union was perpetual or not. So I'm going to start with the historical evidence from before the Constitutional Convention. In secessionist interpretations of history, the states were clearly older than the Union, dating well before the Declaration of Independence. The immediate history before the Constitutional Convention seemed to these men to confirm the importance of the states. South Carolina's 1860 Secession Convention, for example, drew on the Articles of Confederation to make their points. Article 2 of this document, written in 1778, well before the Constitution, read that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not expressly delegated to the federal government. So for these secessionists, the existence of the word state was critical here because it indicated the existence of sovereign entities at a time preceding the Constitutional Convention. Now, the men who stayed in the Union disputed this account, and I bet you can guess that the foremost supporter of the perpetual Union theory was none other than President Abraham Lincoln himself. And you are all probably pretty intimately familiar with Lincoln's words in the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address, but the 16th president did some of his best constitutional reasoning in his first inaugural address, delivered March 4th, 1861, only about a month before hostilities began. In that speech, Lincoln gave a full explanation for why he believed secession to be illegal. He argued, in the contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. And like the secessionists, Lincoln drew on early American history to try to prove his case. According to Lincoln, the Union was formed by the Articles of Association in 1774. 2 years later, Lincoln continued, the Union was then matured by the Declaration of Independence. And just like the secessionists, Lincoln pointed to 1778 as the critical year when the Second Continental Congress wrote the Articles of Confederation. Unlike the secessionists, he drew on a different part of that document, the title. He argued that we ought to be referring to the Articles of Confederation by their full name, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. So Lincoln's argument looks pretty good here. It's right there in the title. The document expressly indicated a commitment to perpetuity. But Lincoln makes no reference to Article 2 in his speech, seemingly unconcerned about the rhetoric of state sovereignty. So on the historical evidence leading up to the Constitutional Convention, the record is a little bit mixed. Maybe Lincoln comes out a little bit on top here. The record on the second type of evidence from the Constitutional Convention and from the Constitution itself was equally mixed. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln tried to draw a straight line from the Articles of Confederation to the new Constitution, which was again created in order to form a more perfect union. Here, Lincoln emphasized the word perfect. He declared, if destruction of the Union by one or by a part only of the states be lawfully possible, the Union is less perfect than before the Constitution, having lost the vital element of perpetuity. Lincoln makes a powerful argument here. If the Constitution made the Union more perfect by further uniting the states in harmony, any destruction of that whole would be inherently imperfect. But the secessionists had arguments of their own, and these lay in tracing the origins of the Constitutional Convention. As these men pointed out, the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention had been charged with a particular task in 1787. Their task was to revise the Articles of Confederation and submit these as amendments to state legislatures for unanimous ratification. But we know this is not what the Philadelphia Convention did. the delegates completely ignored their instructions. They wrote a new constitution, and they charged the states with creating ratifying conventions to approve the new document. These ratifying conventions could ratify or not ratify the Constitution, and if they didn't, these states would remain outside the Union. In this circumstance, the line from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution was broken. The Constitution had dissolved, and it was remade by the Union had been dissolved and had been remade by the Articles by the Constitution. Thus, the more perfect union was a brand new union in 1787. It was not the same union from the Articles of Confederation. This was also a powerful argument. Several secessionists even used this line of reasoning, the breaking up of the old union and the creation of a new union, as the basis for the new Confederacy. Numerous secessionists argued that they were the real inheritors of the Founding Fathers' ideals. They modeled the Confederate Constitution almost directly on the U.S. Constitution, with few exceptions. The most important of these, of course, being that they expressly protected slavery. But still, they tried to really model their society on what they believed the Founding Fathers thought. The history of the Constitutional Convention helped fuel arguments about the legality of their work. So this is a very powerful argument, and it's one that Lincoln tries to deal with by talking about this idea of perpetuity through the preamble to the Constitution. Lincoln and others who believed in a perpetual union claimed that the Philadelphia Convention had gotten around this sort of by incorporating the language of the Articles of Confederation into the preamble. This, to Lincoln and others, showed clear continuity. But the record was obviously mixed, and the ambiguity of the preamble didn't really do Lincoln any favors. So Lincoln may have won the first round, but the secessionists were really giving some good evidence in the second round. The third type of evidence that both sides drew on, the letters and speeches of the Founding Fathers, provided an equally convoluted picture. The biggest supporters of the new Constitution, the authors of the famed Federalist Papers, serve as a good example of this. These papers were authored by three men, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Of the three, only John Jay was consistent in arguing that the great object of the Philadelphia Convention had been to preserve and perpetuate the Union. The other two men seemed to play both sides. Madison privately told Hamilton that he believed the states ratifying the Constitution were making a commitment forever. But he gave no warning of this in the Federalist Papers. Instead, he emphasized the role of sovereignty of the states. Hamilton also was hard to pin down, as was often the case with Hamilton. In the Federalist Papers, he hinted at an indissoluble union, but did not say whether this was expressly part of the Constitution or just his hope that the nation would stay together. Of course, during the ratification debates, the men who spoke most fervently about the perpetual union were those who opposed the Constitution. These anti-federalists warned of the consolidation of the states that would make them individually impotent. Some even warned that the Constitutional Convention had made secession impossible. But many of the biggest supporters of the Constitution insisted that the states joining the new union were not bound forever. None of the various state ratifying conventions acknowledged that they were entering a perpetual union. They merely agreed to assent to and ratify the Constitution. John Dickinson of Delaware spoke for many when he declared that the Union would be, quote, a confederacy of republics in which the sovereignty of each state was equally represented, end quote. Not really a strong argument for perpetual union. In the months and years following the ratification of the Constitution, the founders muddied the waters even further, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison serve as really good examples of this. Because during the late 1790s, Madison and Jefferson developed a doctrine of state sovereignty in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that secessionists were going to draw upon widely in the coming years. Jefferson and Madison didn't even seem to agree on what this doctrine of state sovereignty meant. Jefferson may have loved the Union, but he tended to see it as a means rather than an end in itself. And his concerns about secession seemed to be more about its wisdom than its constitutionality. Madison was far more circumspect about the validity of secession, and he later argued that the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions gave no countenance to nullifying federal laws or seceding without cause. So as with a lot of other constitutional problems in this period, you could find a wide range of arguments depending upon which founders you asked and when you were asking them. The record was decidedly mixed. The evidence from the period before the Constitution, from the Constitutional Convention, and from the ratification debates had no clear winner in this discussion. But this mixed record is really important for what it tells us about the Civil War and its relationship to the Constitution. It really highlights the deep constitutional and political thinking that Americans on both sides of the secession crisis were engaging in. It also really illustrates the uncertainty of the moment, the precarious of the democratic experiment, what that experiment was going to mean. And most of all, it shows us that there were no definite answers about what was going to happen in the war in 1861. In the end, the question of the perpetual union was decided by three important factors. The first was the U.S. Army, whose victories on the battlefield would prevent the Confederacy from succeeding in their quest to dissolve the Union. The second was an 1869 case, Texas v. White, in which a majority of the Supreme Court held that the Union was indestructible and thus not dissoluble by any action of a state, the government, or the people. And finally, following the war, Americans increasingly referred to their country as a nation rather than as a union, which explains a lot about why we don't really use that word anymore. So by the 20th century, the nation had become perpetual. But it's nice to remember that Americans were not so sure if the Union was perpetual in 1861. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.